Still in generation 4 of collect, emulate, avoid. Now we're going to talk about the Amiga 500 and 600. Now, the reason why these are both going to be in the same video is because they are not vastly different machines. And as usual, I'll try and be as comprehensive as I can with these things. So the 500, the Commodore Amiga 500, came out in 1987 and was a reasonably costly 16-bit machine, if not compared to computers, but compared to the consoles that came about later on in the generation. It was reasonably costly. So they're not exactly difficult to find, but they are rarer. But I'll try and explain the differences between the two. So you've got the 500 model. Now this came out in the UK and Europe, and it came out definitely in Canada and the US. It came out in Australia and New Zealand. So basically there's a PAL version and there's an NTSC version, and I'll go into later on the differences. Well, the differences between the two are quite obvious, but there's reasons why the PAL versions are the better version to get. So the 500 came out with 512K of RAM, which was later expanded. You could expand it to a megabyte. It's a much bigger machine. But basically, gaming-wise, these were good because you didn't have to use boot floppies to get anything running. This is what makes the 500 and 600 so good, is that you didn't need to... most computers at the time, certainly ones for gaming, you had to use boot floppies and things to get games running on them. So you had to set up the operating system from a disk. Not the Commodore machines, admittedly, but a lot of the gaming, the PCs at the time, you had to set up stuff from a disk in order to get things running. I mean, even in the early days of PC gaming. So with PCs, even in the early 90s, quite often you had to use a boot disk with them as well, because the games that you wanted to run wouldn't run alongside the operating system, so you had to use a boot disk in order to allocate more memory to as conventional memory in order to run the games. So you still, even on reasonably high-end PCs, you still had to use boot disks in order to run your favourite games quite often. And this, you didn't need to use them with the A500. So that was obviously a good thing. Now, I want to go on to talk about the A600 because that's going to be the main focus now. The A500 is a piece of history, really, to tell us why we got onto the A600. Now, it came about basically because it was smaller, it was cheaper. Because bear in mind, the A500, while not at the lofty heights of PC money, was also much more expensive than a console at the time, a games console. And the A600 meant that they could be produced a lot cheaper. But there's also bonuses to go along with the A600. It had a more enhanced chipset. It had a brand new OS that was more. It was more of a streamlined OS. It worked a lot better with the hardware. And one of the major points, which was seen as a bit of a drawback at the time, was the PCM-CIA port that was included. Which I'm going to call can't bus, actually, because PCM-CIA is quite hard to remember. But anyway, that was seen as a drawback at the time, because when the system came out, it was £400. Now, at the time, a PCM, a card bus card, was around about the same sort of money. So they would run between sort of £200 and £500, depending on what the card did. Especially if it was storage, they were an awful lot of money. But the card bus port is actually seen retroactively as a really good thing. Because now you can buy all sorts of accessories on card bus very, very cheap, that will work with your Amiga 600. So it's actually what was historically seen as a reasonably expensive and a flaw, has turned out to be one of the best selling points of that machine. The A600 was by far the most popular, mostly because of the price point, because now, I mean, £400 was still an awful lot of money. But bearing in mind the selling point of this machine is, you know, you could do your homework on it and do the artistry applications on it were very much a selling point. The graphics was very much a selling point, but it would also play games. And most of the bundles contained, the software bundles you bought with the machine contained a handful of games and a few software packages, obviously the system itself, a mouse, maybe a joystick, but most of the accessories were cheap enough. Now, the A600 does RF, it does composite, and it does RGB. However, the RGB cables are very difficult to find, they are reasonably expensive, and there is no guarantee they will work with modern televisions, although obviously you can use some sort of upscaler. But they were actually designed, originally they were designed to work with sort of higher end monitors rather than televisions. This is for the RGB connection. So I dare say there are people that will make cables with a SCART block on the end, but at the time of researching this I couldn't find any. So there probably are. I'm obviously not looking in the right places. The good thing about the A600 is it's a great system for modders, and it's not like finding a modded Super Nintendo or a modded Mega Drive. There won't be switches on the outside and funny LEDs and things like that. Because most of the people that mod these things, they do internal mods. Now, these are the main reason for buying one of these A600s, is because there are so many third-party hardware devices that are meant to be put internally, and a lot of them these days don't even require you to have any soldering knowledge or anything like that. I mean, most of them are designed, I mean, there are so many upgrades available that it is unbelievable, and most of them will plug in somewhere on the board. There are obviously ones that require soldering as well, but a lot of the better upgrades don't. There are people making them that you can just fit them onto existing components and things like that. And there's even OS upgrades that can be fitted into. You basically just take the old chip out and plug a new one in. I mean, it really is quite handy for things like that. So this is what a lot of Amiga 600s are now. They look as if they're the original stock, but if you open the top up, there's so much extra stuff in there. And people have worked out ways to add. There are people that even they'll put in like 4 gig flash drive upgrades into these things to play the games directly from flash drive. And this is one of the things that I want to go into for anyone that's thinking of getting an NTSE machine. Now, Like I say, a lot of the stuff was released in PAL territories only, but if you're going to run games off a flash card anyway, you can go online and you can find these games, and they are NTSC versions of PAL released games that you can download. They've been specifically translated, I suppose, in order to work with NTSC hardware, so you can do that. So that, I mean, that's very easy to do. If you've got a working knowledge of emulation, you can do this with these machines. So that is an option for you NTSC people. So that's US and Canada. If you have an NTSC machine, you might be better off buying getting the NTSC versions of the games and just running them, or writing them to floppies anyway and then running them. So the thing is, because there is an amazing, certainly in the UK, the fans of this machine tend to be quite devoted to their Amigas, and this is why there is this massive glut of hardware around for them. So I imagine that there's probably people that are doing these things all over the world, because Amiga, it's, even in countries where it didn't sell well originally, it has started to become quite popular lately. So there's lots of stuff you can buy for them, but usually they are internal components. So as for the games, no, most of them are really, really good, and it depends. It really depends on what you like to play and how you like to play it, for the most part. I mean, obviously anything that lends itself to a joystick, so like a 3-button joystick with a keyboard or mouse, is going to play really, really well. And in fact, for that sort of game, the Amiga versions are considered the best versions. So I'm talking about stuff like Cannon Fodder or Megalomania, Lemmings, that sort of thing. For other stuff, like later on in the life cycle of the A600, a port of Street Fighter 2 was released for it, which when you're using joysticks, like a 3-button joystick where the buttons are actually on the top of the joystick, Street Fighter 2 doesn't lend itself to that sort of play very well. Although you can obviously, because it's a standard fitting, you can obviously buy pads that will plug in, and I'm pretty sure that there are 6-button pads available. I've just never actually seen them myself. No, a lot of the good games did get ports to other consoles later on. So that's stuff like Zool obviously got ported to a lot of systems. Lemmings did. Chaos Engine, Megalomania, Cannon Fodder, Syndicate, Flashback, things like that. They all got ports to other consoles. So it basically comes down to what you like to play and how you like to play it, and which machines lend themselves to the better games. Personally, I prefer playing something like Zool on an actual console with a control pad, but it was originally an Amiga game. So I mean, that's the first system it came out for, I think. So like I said, the selling points was the graphics. So obviously something like well, I mean, lots of stuff graphically just looked better on the Amiga. That's the way it is. So, but the games all came in these big boxes, like PC boxes, and usually, you know, so they take up quite a lot of space on the shelf. And they were usually filled with manuals, and this is the other thing I want to get into. Quite often in these game boxes were the anti-piracy measures, and this is going to be a problem to anyone that does want to play things off an internal disk inside the computer itself. is that this is when game piracy started to become a good thing, especially with disc-based games, floppy disk-based games like the Amiga had. And quite often when you start a game, the first screen that you will be presented with is, you know, something along the lines of go to page X in the manual, and on line X, word X is this word, type it in the box. So obviously if you don't have the manual, if you don't have the original game with the manual, you're not going to be able to do that. There were other things like there were code wheels included, where you had to move the wheel to a certain point and type in the letter or number that appeared there. There were match up the faces, again, the same sort of idea. So obviously if you don't have the original game, you could probably look up how to do it online to get past the code screen, but if you don't have that, you're not going to be able to get any further into the game. So because it was designed to stop people copying the games. So the anti-piracy measures are usually a physical thing in the box that comes along with the game. So if you don't have that, you might be a bit stuck, and this is the only real drawback to playing stuff off an internal card as opposed to playing the real thing. So again, bearing in mind that a lot of games came on floppy disk rather, the drives in Amigas tend to be reasonably reliable over the course of time, but the discs themselves unfortunately are not. They are very, like all floppy disks, they are very susceptible to moisture and heat and cold and things like that, and they're magnetically sensitive, obviously. So this is what I would say for anyone that is thinking of collecting for this system. Now, when you find these things, pay very close attention to the box that it comes in, because that is going to be a major indicator of what condition the machine itself is going to be in. Now, the Amigas came with these giant power packs, is the first thing. Now, these are, again, they're very sensitive to moisture, and they're very sensitive to changes in temperature. So if you do find one, before you even turn it on to try it, I would let the whole thing and the power supply acclimatise to your house for a few days before you even try it. Because if there is any damp in that giant power brick, and the thing is as big as your face, if there's any damp or condensation in there, the moment you turn it on, you will break it. So do let these things acclimatise. They seem to be extra sensitive to that sort of thing because they have ventilation on the side. It's not like a Nintendo power supply where the transformer is a sealed unit. The Amiga ones have vent holes in the side, so therefore if any damp got in over the time it was stored, you switch it on, you will break it. It's just that simple. But quite often the boxes these things come in are a very good indicator. Often they will be in the original box. And if the box is in really good condition, looks like it's been well looked after, then you're probably okay. Not a hard and fast rule, but do, again, pay attention to what the boxes look like. Now, if you find floppy disks in a big box with the manual and the, all the stuff, again, there's no guarantee it will work, but it's likely to work as opposed to one that you find lying about loose in a paper sleeve or in the bottom of the console box or something like that. The one in its original box with all the stuff is more likely to work because it's obviously been looked after. It's obviously been stored quite well. If the box looks like it's got wet, then the stuff inside may well have got wet as well. So if you are buying one of these in a box, do check the condition of the box. That's the best way to work out how these things have been treated. The thing is, even collectors generally, and this is down to the condition of the floppy disks, basically, even the best floppy disks you find will wear with use. That's just a fact. That's a fact. So even a lot of collectors that have the original floppy disks won't use them to play the games on the machine. They will play them usually from an internal card. And you can even buy elaborate front ends for these things. Like if you've seen a MAME front end running on a PC, something like is it Rocket Launcher? Anyway, the sort of thing. It's there are even these elaborate front ends where you can add video and pictures and things of the stuff you're going to run. Even collectors will generally do it this way because they don't want to wear out their floppy disks. Because they do wear out. They wear out with use, as all magnetic media does. So because these things are getting on for the best part of 20-25 years old, they generally play them from internal drives inside the machine. So that is something to consider if you are going to collect. You may want to do some of these mods anyway, although obviously a lot of collectors are funny about modding their machines. They'll probably have one that they keep as original stock and then one they actually use for playing on. That's pretty much it. So all I have to do now is come up with a verdict on the console, I think. So that's definitely not going to be a void, because a lot of these games really are worth it. Now, is it emulate? Definitely, I would say at least emulate. If you can emulate on the original hardware, even better. Although do bear in mind that this piracy issue is going to come up for not the majority of games, but maybe 40% of the games you play. This anti-piracy is going to be an issue. So do you collect? Well, now here's the thing. If you live in an NTSC region, then by all means do collect, because I mean you did get some good games. Most of the bigger titles, the most well-known stuff, yes, you did get them and they were there, but bearing in mind that the NTSC versions generally are a lot more money because there were far less of them. The NTSC console is generally a lot more money, although if you have to actually ship one from Europe, then it might work out about the same anyway. Because again, the NTSC console computer rather is rarer. But it does mean your collection is going to be a lot smaller. Now, bearing in mind the size of the boxes that most of these games came in, that might be a good thing, because they are shelf space. They are the equivalent of big box PC games from the 90s. They take up shelf space. So maybe a smaller collection is the sort of thing you're going for. If you live in Europe, or the UK rather, I should say, because I don't really know how well this machine did in continental Europe, but certainly in the UK it did very, very well. And you will find the machines, you'll find the games, you will find the games often boxed with all the stuff, because people tended to look after them. And you will find lots of them, and they won't be an awful lot of money. The trouble is your collection will be quite large. There's somewhere, depending on who you believe, there's somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 games released for this machine in Britain. So bearing in mind the size of the game boxes, your collection will end up being rather large by the time you've finished collecting. So if space is a consideration, then definitely do not collect for this machine. But if you think you might have the space, or you're going to have a very well curated collection where you're only going to buy the things you want or exclusive stuff, then by all means, this is a fantastic system to collect for, especially if you live in Britain, because the stuff is reasonably cheap, and you can find it at every boot sale, computer fair, anything like that. So that's probably going to be my final verdict. It is definitely emulate, but collect with an if and a but attached. So that's going to be about it, I think. Me personally, I don't collect for the Amiga because I never had one growing up. I had friends that had them, and I obviously enjoyed playing them when I was around there or whatever, but it's just not something I collect for, which is a shame, because quite often I do see stuff that I go, oh, you know, the Amiga version of that was really, really good. I should really get an Amiga, but I collect enough stuff, quite frankly. It's not something I particularly... I could do without collecting something else, to be fair. Anyway, that's enough about me. So let's do all the bit that I normally do at the end. If you like the video, then press like, because it helps me out a lot. And if you want to subscribe to see more content, then please do. Comment if you fancy doing that, and follow me on Twitter, because you not only will you get notification of when new stuff goes up, but you'll also might get some insights into my rantings and photos and things like that happens to me in my daily life when I'm not doing this, but also mostly focusing on this. The next video in this series is going to be on the Neo Geo. And not just the AES, but there might be there's a little bit on the MVS. There's some stuff on the Neo Geo CD, which a lot of people don't seem to know about. But yeah, so the next video in this series is still going to be on the Neo Geo. So do stay tuned for that. You know, and I will see you next time.